I never thought the happiest day of my son's life would become the most humiliating day of mine. Standing there in my best dress, the navy blue one I'd saved 3 months to buy, I felt smaller than I ever had in my 58 years. The church bells were ringing, guests were arriving in their expensive cars, and I was frozen at the entrance like a beggar asking for scraps. "You're not welcome here, Mom. She never liked you." Those words came from my Andres, my only child, the boy I'd raised with calloused hands and sleepless nights, the son I'd given everything to, my youth, my dreams, my dignity, standing there in his perfect tuxedo, looking at me like I was an embarrassment he needed to hide from his new life. Behind him I could see her, Patricia, my daughter-in-law who'd never missed a chance to remind me that I wasn't educated enough, refined enough, worthy enough for their circle. She stood there with that cold smile of hers, the one that said, "I told you so," without moving her lips. Her family gathered around her like a protective wall, all of them dressed in clothes that cost more than I made in 6 months at the laundromat. I remember thinking about all those double shifts I'd worked to pay for his college, all those nights I'd eaten beans and rice so he could have meat on his plate, all those times I'd walked to work in the rain to save bus fare for his textbooks. My hands, rough from years of washing other people's clothes, trembled as I held the small gift I'd wrapped so carefully, a photo album filled with pictures of him growing up, each one a memory of love he was now rejecting. The other guests began to notice. I could feel their eyes on me, hear the whispers starting. "Isn't that his mother? Why is she standing outside? How embarrassing." The shame burned through me like acid, spreading from my chest to my face, making my cheeks flush red with humiliation. I wanted to say something, to remind him of who I was, of everything I'd sacrificed. I wanted to tell him about the night he was born, when I held him in my arms and promised I'd never let anyone hurt him. I wanted to remind him of the fever that almost took him when he was 7, and how I stayed awake for 3 days straight, praying and cooling his forehead with wet towels because I couldn't afford a private doctor. But the words wouldn't come. They stuck in my throat like stones, heavy and impossible to swallow. Because deep down, in the part of my heart that still believed in my son's goodness, I knew this wasn't really him speaking. This was her voice, her poison, her manipulation finally winning the war she'd been fighting against me for 3 years. Patricia had been patient, I'll give her that. She never attacked me directly. Instead, she'd make little comments about my simple ways, suggest that perhaps I should take English classes to improve myself, or mention how her mother was so sophisticated and well-traveled. She'd invite Andres to family gatherings that somehow never included me, creating a new world where I didn't exist. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And please comment which city you're watching from. I watched my son's face, searching for any sign of the boy who used to run to me when he was scared, who called me his superhero mom when I fixed his broken toys with tape and prayers. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd chosen comfort over love, status over loyalty. The wedding photographer approached, probably wondering why the groom's mother was standing outside like a stranger. Andres quickly whispered something to him, and I saw the man's expression change from confusion to pity. They would take their perfect pictures without me, create their beautiful memories as if I'd never existed. I turned around slowly, my feet feeling like they were made of lead. Each step away from that church was a step away from the life I'd built, the relationship I'd treasured, the future I'd imagined. Behind me, I could hear the music starting, the celebration beginning without the woman who'd made it all possible. The walk home felt endless. Neighbors peered through their curtains, and I knew they'd all heard. In our small community, news traveled faster than the wind. By evening, everyone would know that Maria Torres had been turned away from her own son's wedding. The woman who'd been so proud of her boy, who'd bragged about his success to anyone who'd listen, had been publicly rejected by the child she'd raised alone. That night, I sat in my small kitchen, still wearing that navy blue dress, staring at the photo album I'd brought back home. Each picture told a story of love, sacrifice, and dreams. Here was Andres at his high school graduation, beaming as he hugged me tight. Here he was at his college graduation, thanking me in his speech for being the strongest woman he knew. But as I sat there in the silence of my empty house, I realized something that would change everything. This pain, this humiliation, this betrayal. It wasn't just happening to me. It was revealing something about my son's character that I'd been too blinded by love to see. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath all the hurt and shock, a small flame of dignity began to flicker. I might have been unwelcome at his wedding, but I was still his mother. And mothers, real mothers, don't disappear just because their children choose to forget them. The phone calls stopped first. Those Sunday conversations that had been our tradition for 25 years simply vanished, like they'd never existed at all. I'd sit by the phone every weekend, waiting for that familiar ring, telling myself he was probably just busy with honeymoon preparations, then with settling into married life. But weeks turned into months, and the silence grew heavier with each passing day. When I finally gathered the courage to call him, Patricia would answer with that sweet, fake voice of hers. "Oh, Maria, how lovely to hear from you. Andres is in the shower right now. I'll tell him you called." But he never called back. Not once. I left messages that went unanswered, sent texts that were read but never replied to. It was as if I'd become invisible in my own son's life. The first time I saw them together after the wedding was at the grocery store 3 months later. I was standing in the cleaning supplies aisle, comparing prices like I always did, when I heard his laugh. That same laugh that used to fill our small apartment when he was young, when we'd watch old movies together on Friday nights because we couldn't afford to go out. I turned the corner, and there they were, shopping like a perfect couple from a magazine. Patricia was dressed in designer clothes, pushing a cart full of expensive organic foods, while Andres followed behind her like a devoted puppy. When he saw me, I watched his face change. The joy drained out of it, replaced by something I'd never seen before. Embarrassment. He was embarrassed by me. "Hello, mijo," I said softly, using the pet name I'd called him since he was a baby. "How are you?" Patricia stepped closer to him, linking her arm through his in a gesture that was clearly territorial. "We're wonderful, aren't we, darling? Just picking up a few things for our dinner party tonight. We're having some of Andres's colleagues over." The way she said colleagues made it clear that I wouldn't fit into that world, that my presence would somehow contaminate their perfect evening. Andres barely made eye contact with me, mumbling a quick, "We should go, honey," before steering the cart away. But not before Patricia delivered her final blow. "You know, Maria, we've been meaning to mention, we're thinking of moving to the suburbs. Andres thinks it would be better for us to have some space, build our own traditions. I'm sure you understand." I understood perfectly. They were erasing me completely, removing any possibility that I might accidentally intrude on their new life. As I watched them walk away, I noticed other shoppers staring, some with pity, others with curiosity. The whole neighborhood knew what had happened at the wedding by now, and here was the sequel, the complete abandonment of a mother who'd given everything. At home that evening, I found myself looking through old photo albums again, but this time with different eyes. I saw myself in picture after picture, always giving, always sacrificing, always putting Andres first. At his school plays, I was the mother cheering loudest in the back row because I had to work late and arrived just in time. At his sports games, I was the woman bringing homemade sandwiches because I couldn't afford the concession stand prices. In every memory, I was the supporting character in my own son's story. The woman who made things possible but was never quite good enough to be included in the celebration. My sister Carmen visited that week, bringing her own painful observations. "Maria, I have to tell you something," she said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table. "I ran into Patricia's mother at the bank yesterday. She was bragging about how they'd helped Andres see the truth about his upbringing, and how he was finally free to become the man he was meant to be." The words hit me like physical blows. They'd turned my love into a burden, my sacrifices into obstacles. Everything I'd done to lift him up was now being painted as something that had held him back. Carmen continued, her voice gentle but firm. She said they're already planning to start a family, and they want to make sure the children grow up in the right environment with the right influences. The implication was clear. I was neither right nor influential enough to be part of my future grandchildren's lives. That night, I lay awake thinking about my mother, long gone now, who'd raised 5 children through the Depression. She'd told me once, "Mija, love is not supposed to make you smaller. If someone's love makes you disappear, it's not love at all." I hadn't understood what she meant then, but lying there in the darkness, I finally did. The breaking point came 2 weeks later when I saw the announcement in the local newspaper. Patricia was pregnant, and they'd given an interview to the society section about their blessed news and their plans for the future. In the photo, they looked radiant and complete, a perfect family unit that had no room for grandmothers who worked in laundromats and lived in small apartments. But what destroyed me wasn't the pregnancy announcement. It was the quote from Andres. "Patricia and I believe in looking forward, not backward. We want to give our child every advantage, surround them with positive influences and opportunities. We're so grateful to be starting fresh together." Starting fresh. As if his entire childhood, our entire relationship, was something dirty that needed to be washed away. As if 25 years of love and sacrifice were just backward influences that might contaminate his perfect new life. I cut out the article and put it in my kitchen drawer, not because I wanted to treasure it, but because I needed to remember. I needed to remember the exact moment when my son looked at a newspaper photographer and told the world that his mother was someone he needed to leave behind. The neighbors' whispers grew louder after that. At the corner store, conversations would stop when I walked in. At church, people would give me those sympathetic looks that somehow made me feel worse than their judgment might have. Everyone knew that Maria Torres had been completely erased from her son's new life, and everyone was watching to see how I'd handle it. Some offered unwanted advice. "Maybe you should fight for your rights," suggested Mrs. Hernandez from down the street. "Maybe you should show up at their house and demand to be heard," said my coworker Rosa. But I couldn't bring myself to beg for love that was clearly being withheld on purpose. Instead, I began to notice things I'd missed before. How Patricia had slowly isolated Andres from all his old friends. How she'd convinced him that his childhood neighborhood was beneath them now. How she'd systematically replaced every connection to his past with something newer and supposedly better. She was building a fortress around my son, and I was the enemy she was keeping out. I started showing up to places where I knew they might be, not to cause trouble, but because I couldn't accept that I'd become a stranger to my own son. The farmer's market on Saturday mornings, the bookstore where Andres used to love browsing, the coffee shop near his office. I wasn't stalking. I was hoping for a moment when Patricia wasn't there, when I might catch a glimpse of the boy I'd raised beneath the man he'd become. The humiliation was always the same. That look of discomfort when he'd see me, the way he'd glance around nervously as if my presence might contaminate his reputation. Once, I approached him at the coffee shop while he was alone, reading a newspaper. "Andres," I said softly, sliding into the chair across from him. "Please, just 5 minutes. I just want to know how you're doing." He looked up with eyes that seemed older somehow, more guarded. "Mom, this isn't appropriate. Patricia isn't here," I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is just us. Your mother asking about your life." For a moment, I saw something flicker in his expression, maybe regret, maybe longing. But then his phone buzzed with a text message, and whatever softness I'd glimpsed disappeared immediately. "I have to go," he said, standing up so quickly he knocked over his coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across the table between us like a stain, and he didn't even try to clean it up. He just left me sitting there with the mess, watching other customers stare at the woman whose own son couldn't bear to share a cup of coffee with her. The baby shower invitation never came, of course. I learned about it the same way I learned about everything else in my son's life now, from Carmen, who'd heard it from someone who'd heard it from someone else. Patricia's family had thrown an elaborate celebration at some fancy hotel downtown, complete with flowers flown in from Ecuador and a cake that cost more than my monthly rent. I drove by the hotel that day, not to crash the party, but just to see. Just to witness this milestone in my future grandchild's life from the outside, like a homeless person pressing her face against a restaurant window. I sat in my old car across the street, watching elegant women in expensive dresses carry beautifully wrapped gifts inside. I recognized some of Andres's college friends, people who used to come to our apartment for Sunday dinners when he was in school, people who'd eaten my food and told me I was like a second mother to them. None of them had thought to mention the baby shower to me. I'd brought a gift anyway, a hand-knitted blanket that had taken me 3 months to finish, working on it every evening after my shift at the laundromat. It was soft yellow wool, neutral colors since I didn't know if the baby would be a boy or a girl. Each stitch had been made with love, with prayers for a grandchild I might never be allowed to hold. When the party ended and guests began leaving, I saw Patricia surrounded by her friends, laughing and glowing with pregnancy happiness. Andres walked beside her, carrying armfuls of gifts, looking every inch the devoted husband and father-to-be. They looked like people who had everything they could possibly want. I waited until they'd driven away, then walked across the street and gave my gift to the hotel doorman. "Could you please make sure this gets to Mrs. Patricia Torres?" I asked. "It's for the baby." The doorman, a kind-faced older man, looked at me with understanding. Maybe he'd seen this scene before. Maybe he recognized the particular sadness of a grandmother who wasn't allowed to be one. "Of course, Señora. I'll make sure she gets it." I never found out if Patricia kept the blanket or threw it away, but making it had given me something to do with my hands, something to channel my love into, even if that love had nowhere to go. The worst moment came when I ran into Patricia at the doctor's office 6 months into her pregnancy. I was there for my annual checkup, something I'd been putting off because of the cost, when I saw her in the waiting room. Her belly was round and beautiful, and she was glowing the way pregnant women do when they're happy and well cared for. "Maria," she said with that bright, fake smile. "What a surprise to see you here." I should have just nodded and walked away, but something desperate in me made me try one more time. "Patricia, you look wonderful. How are you feeling? Is the baby healthy?" "Oh yes, perfectly healthy," she said, placing a protective hand over her stomach. "We're having a boy. Andres is so excited. He's already talking about soccer lessons and college plans." She paused, then delivered her poison with surgical precision. "We've decided to name him after my father. Family tradition, you know. Not after Andres's father, who'd died when my son was just 2 years old. Not after my father, who'd worked himself to death in the fields so his children could have better lives. After her father, the man who'd never met Andres, but was somehow more worthy of having his name carried forward." That's lovely," I managed to say, feeling each word cut my throat on the way out. "We're so grateful that the baby will grow up knowing his real family," Patricia continued, her voice sweet as honey and twice as sticky. "Children need stability, don't you think? Consistency. The right kind of influences from the very beginning." The message was clear. I was the wrong kind of influence. I was instability and inconsistency. I was something to be protected against, not welcomed. When they called my name for my appointment, I stood up on shaking legs. As I walked past Patricia, she called out loudly enough for the entire waiting room to hear, "Give my regards to Andres when you see him." "Oh, wait," she laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I suppose you won't be seeing him, will you?" The other patients stared. The receptionist looked uncomfortable. I wanted to disappear into the floor, to become invisible, to stop existing rather than endure another moment of this public humiliation. But I didn't disappear. I walked into that doctor's office with my head held as high as I could manage, and when the doctor asked about my family history for the chart, I said, "I have a son. He's having a baby." I didn't say I'd been erased from their lives. I didn't say I wasn't allowed to be a grandmother. I just said what was true. I had a son, and he was having a baby. That night, I stood in my bathroom looking at myself in the mirror, really looking for the first time in months. I saw a woman who'd grown old waiting for scraps of love from people who'd already decided she wasn't worth feeding. I saw hands that had worked so hard they were permanently stained and scarred. I saw eyes that had cried so much they looked permanently tired. But I also saw something else. I saw my mother's jaw, set with determination. I saw my grandmother's shoulders, which had carried burdens much heavier than this. I saw generations of women who'd been counted out, written off, dismissed, and who'd found ways to survive anyway. Standing there in my small bathroom, wearing the same old nightgown I'd owned for 5 years, I made a decision. I wouldn't chase them anymore. I wouldn't beg for inclusion in a life where I wasn't wanted. I wouldn't make myself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into spaces that had been deliberately designed to exclude me. I was still Andres's mother, whether he acknowledged it or not. I was still going to be this baby's grandmother, whether they let me or not. And I was still Maria Torres, a woman who'd survived things that would have broken weaker people. The phone calls stopped. The accidental encounters stopped. The desperate attempts to maintain connection stopped. If they wanted to erase me from their story, then I would write my own. The silence in my house became so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the walls. Days passed without my phone ringing, without anyone needing me, without any purpose beyond getting up, going to work, and coming home to the same empty rooms. I'd raised a son in this house, filled these rooms with laughter and homework arguments and birthday celebrations. Now it felt like a museum of a life that had never really happened. I stopped cooking real meals. What was the point of making dinner for one person who had nowhere to be and no one waiting for her? I lived on coffee and whatever was cheapest at the corner store. I stopped buying flowers for the kitchen table, stopped turning on the radio in the mornings, stopped pretending that routine could fill the hole where my family used to be. The neighbors began to worry. Mrs. Hernandez would peek over the fence when I was hanging laundry, asking if I was feeling all right, if I needed anything from the store. But how do you explain to someone that you're disappearing? That every day you exist a little less because the people who made you real have decided you're not worth remembering? Carmen tried to visit more often, bringing groceries I hadn't asked for and gossip I didn't want to hear. She meant well, but her pity felt like another weight on my chest. You should get out more, she'd say. Join that senior center group, take up dancing, find some hobby. As if hobbies could replace the purpose I'd lost when I stopped being anyone's mother. The worst was sleeping in the bed where I used to read bedtime stories, where I'd held Andres when he had nightmares, where I'd planned his future and dreamed about grandchildren who would play in this same house. Now the bed felt enormous and cold, and I'd curl up on one side, leaving space for ghosts of conversations that would never happen. I learned that the baby had been born on a Tuesday in October. Not from Andres, of course, but from Carmen, who'd heard it from her friend who worked at the hospital. A healthy boy, 8 pounds and 2 ounces, born at 3 a.m. after 12 hours of labor. I sat in my kitchen when Carmen told me, calculating that while I'd been sleeping, my first grandchild had entered the world without anyone thinking to call me. They named him Gabriel Andres Torres Morrison. Even in his name, I was erased. Patricia's maiden name taking precedence over the Torres legacy that went back 4 generations. My great-grandfather's name, my grandfather's name, my father's name, all pushed aside to make room for people who'd known my son for 3 years instead of 25. I bought a gift anyway. A small silver bracelet engraved with his birth date, something that could grow with him. Something that might one day tell him that his grandmother had loved him from the moment she knew he existed. I wrapped it carefully in blue paper and drove to their house. A beautiful colonial in the suburbs with a manicured lawn and expensive cars in the driveway. I didn't knock. I didn't try to go inside. I just left the gift on their doorstep with a card that said, "For Gabriel, welcome to the world. Love, Abuela Maria." Then I sat in my car across the street and waited to see if they'd keep it or throw it away. Patricia found it first, picking up the package with the same expression she might wear when discovering dog waste on her porch. She opened it right there on the doorstep, read the card, and I watched her face change from annoyance to fury. She called for Andres, and when he came to the door, I saw them have a heated conversation I couldn't hear but could easily interpret. Andres looked around the neighborhood as if searching for me, and for just a moment, when his eyes passed over my car, I thought he might have seen me. But then Patricia handed him the gift, and I watched my son who I'd taught to be grateful for every kindness, who I'd raised to honor his elders, walk directly to the garbage can and drop my gift inside. The small silver bracelet I'd saved 2 weeks of grocery money to buy was thrown away like trash, along with the card I'd written and rewritten 5 times, trying to find words that wouldn't sound desperate or demanding, but would somehow convey a grandmother's love. That night, I drove back to their house after dark and retrieved the gift from their garbage can. I sat in my car under a streetlight, holding the silver bracelet that would never touch my grandson's wrist. And I finally understood that hope was sometimes just another word for self-torture. The holidays came and went without a single call. Christmas morning, I sat in my living room looking at the small tree I'd put up more from habit than joy, surrounded by gifts I'd bought for people who'd never opened them, a sweater for Andres in his favorite color, a soft toy for Gabriel, a pretty scarf for Patricia that I'd chosen before remembering she'd never want anything from me. I spent Christmas Day watching old movies and eating soup from a can, while somewhere across town, my son was watching his own child experience his first Christmas. There would be photos I'd never see, traditions I'd never be part of, memories being made that would never include me. New Year's Eve was worse. I stood on my small back porch at midnight, listening to fireworks and celebration sounds drifting from other neighborhoods, other families who were together and happy and complete. I thought about making resolutions, but what do you promise yourself when you've already lost everything worth fighting for? The loneliness wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. It filled every corner of every room, made every mirror reflect back a woman who'd become unnecessary to everyone who'd once needed her. I began talking to myself just to hear a human voice, carrying on both sides of conversations with people who weren't there. "Good morning, mijo," I'd say to the empty kitchen. "Did you sleep well?" Then I'd answer in Andres's voice from when he was young. "Yes, Mama, but I had that dream again about flying." It was pathetic, but it was the only way I could remember what it felt like to be somebody's mother. I stopped going to church because I couldn't bear the questions about my family, the careful way people avoided mentioning grandchildren, the pity in their voices when they asked how I was doing. I stopped going to the corner store during busy times because I couldn't handle the small talk with neighbors who knew my situation. I became a ghost in my own neighborhood, invisible by choice rather than by force. The photo albums became my Bible. I'd sit with them for hours, tracing my finger over pictures of birthdays and graduations and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. Here was Andres at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing he'd made of our family. Just him and me. But we were both smiling and holding hands. Here he was at 15, rolling his eyes at the camera but letting me hug him anyway. Here he was at 22, the day he got his first real job, calling me before anyone else to share the good news. When had I stopped being the first person he called? When had I become the last person he wanted to see? But somewhere in those quiet months of grief and isolation, something began to change. Not hope. I'd given up on hope. Not anger. Anger was too exhausting to maintain. Something quieter and more dangerous. Something that felt like acceptance, but sharper. Something that felt like peace, but with an edge. I still had something they'd forgotten about. Something they couldn't take away no matter how completely they erased me from their present. I had his history. I had his story. I had 25 years of truth that no amount of rewriting could change. And truth, I was beginning to understand, has a way of surfacing when people least expect it. I began to watch them differently. Not desperately, not hopefully, but with the quiet attention of someone who finally understood that love and observation were two different things. I could love my son without needing his approval. I could care about my grandson without requiring access to him. I could be a mother without being acknowledged as one. This new clarity came slowly, like dawn breaking over mountains. I started noticing things I'd missed when I was too busy begging for crumbs of affection. The way Andres's shoulders slumped when he walked out of his office building. Even though he was supposedly living his dream life, the circles under his eyes that designer clothes couldn't hide. The way he checked his phone constantly, as if he was waiting for some message that never came. I saw Patricia too, in the grocery store, at the bank, at the places where real life happened outside of their perfect social media presentations. She looked tired in a way that expensive makeup couldn't quite cover. Her smile seemed more forced each time I glimpsed her from a distance. And she was always alone, pushing a stroller by herself, running errands without the village of support she'd seemed to have during her pregnancy. From Carmen's careful observations and my own distant watching, a different picture began to emerge. Patricia's family, so welcoming and involved during the courtship and wedding, had grown notably absent since the baby's birth. Her mother, who'd been so instrumental in orchestrating my exclusion, apparently preferred being a grandmother in theory rather than in practice. Her father, the man whose name my grandson carried, visited maybe once a month and usually had business calls that interrupted his time with the baby. The friends who'd surrounded them during the good times seemed less available now that parenthood had made their lives more complicated and less glamorous. The dinner parties had stopped. The social events they'd once attended every weekend had been replaced by sleepless nights and crying fits and the ordinary chaos of new parenthood. I learned that Andres had been passed over for the promotion he'd been expecting, the one that was supposed to justify the expensive house and the lifestyle Patricia demanded. His colleagues, the ones who'd been so important to impress that he'd banned his mother from his life, were apparently less loyal than he'd imagined. When he needed support, when the pressure of providing for a family became overwhelming, they were nowhere to be found. But I didn't feel satisfaction in their struggles. I felt something more complex, a recognition that the life they'd built was as fragile as it was beautiful, and that isolation was a dangerous foundation for any family. I started writing. Not letters to them. I'd learned that lesson, but to myself, to Gabriel, to the future. I wrote down every story about Andres' childhood, every lesson I'd taught him, every moment of joy and growth and discovery that had shaped him into the man he'd become before Patricia convinced him to forget where he came from. I wrote about the time he was 8 and brought home a stray kitten, insisting we had to keep it even though our landlord didn't allow pets. How we hid that cat for 3 months, sneaking it food and keeping it quiet during inspections, until we finally found it a good home with an elderly neighbor who needed the companionship. "Mama," he'd said then, "sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing, but you do it anyway because love makes you brave." I wrote about his teenage years, when he'd grown embarrassed by our small apartment and our secondhand furniture, but still brought his friends home because he knew I'd feed them and treat them like family. How he'd gradually learned that home wasn't about having the nicest things, but about having people who cared about your happiness more than appearances. I wrote about his college years, when he'd call me every Sunday night just to talk, to tell me about his classes and his dreams and his fears about the future. How he'd always end those calls by saying, "Mama, I know I don't say it enough, but everything good in me came from you. I'm going to make you proud." Each story I wrote was a small act of resistance against the erasure they'd attempted. They could remove me from their present, but they couldn't change the fact that I'd been there for every important moment of his first 25 years. They couldn't rewrite the history of who had loved him first, longest, and most unconditionally. I also began to remember my own mother's wisdom with new understanding. She'd lived through her own share of family betrayals, had watched children she'd sacrificed for choose comfort over loyalty. "Mija," she used to tell me, "people can forget where they came from, but life has a way of reminding them. Your job isn't to force the lesson. Your job is to be ready when they're ready to learn." I stopped watching their house. I stopped driving by their neighborhood. I stopped asking Carmen for updates or listening to gossip from neighbors. Instead, I focused on rebuilding myself from the foundation up, creating a life that had value independent of whether my son acknowledged my existence. I returned to things I'd abandoned when all my energy went to chasing after people who didn't want to be caught. I started reading again, losing myself in stories about women who'd survived worse than abandonment and found ways to thrive. I began cooking for myself again. Not elaborate meals, but good, nourishing food that reminded my body it deserved care. I cleaned my house thoroughly, not because I was expecting visitors, but because I deserved to live in beauty and order. I planted flowers in my small garden, choosing varieties that would bloom at different times throughout the year so there would always be something beautiful to look at from my kitchen window. Most importantly, I began to forgive myself. For the years I'd spent making myself smaller to fit into other people's expectations, for the times I'd apologized for taking up space, or needing attention, or having opinions that differed from those around me, for believing that my worth was determined by how much other people valued me. I was 58 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself instead of for someone else's approval. It felt strange and frightening and liberating all at once. The neighborhood began to notice the change in me. Mrs. Hernandez commented that I looked healthier, more rested. The mailman mentioned that my garden was the prettiest on the block. Small conversations that once felt forced now felt natural, because I wasn't carrying the weight of desperate sadness into every interaction. I wasn't happy, not yet, but I was no longer drowning. I was no longer shrinking. I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide I was worthy of love. And in that new space, that place of quiet strength I was building for myself, I began to sense something approaching. Not hope exactly, but possibility. Not rescue, but opportunity. Not the restoration of what I'd lost, but the chance to discover what I might gain. The storm that had destroyed my old life was finally ending. I could feel it in the air, in the way my shoulders no longer carried constant tension, in the way I could sleep through the night without anxiety dreams. What came next wouldn't be a return to how things were. That was impossible, but it might be something different, something better, something I couldn't even imagine yet. I just had to be patient a little longer. I just had to trust that the truth I'd been carrying all these months would find its own way to the surface when the time was right. The call came on a Thursday morning in March, almost 2 years after the wedding that had changed everything. I was in my garden, planting tomatoes and thinking about nothing more complicated than whether the last frost had really passed, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Torres? The voice was young, female, nervous. "This is Jennifer from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Andres Torres." The world tilted sideways. Hospital calls were never good news, and I hadn't been anyone's emergency contact for so long that I'd forgotten what that responsibility felt like. My hands started shaking before I even heard what came next. "He's been in an accident. A car accident. He's stable now, but he's been asking for you. He's been saying your name over and over, and we found your contact information in his wallet. He seems very distressed that you're not here." I was in my car before she finished explaining the details. "Room 314, visiting hours until 8, bring identification." The drive to the hospital felt endless and instant at the same time. I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen him, months ago in that coffee shop, how he'd knocked over his cup in his hurry to get away from me. Now he was asking for me, saying my name, wanting his mother. The hospital hallways were exactly as sterile and frightening as they'd been when he was 7 years old, and I'd spent 3 days by his bedside during that terrible fever. The same antiseptic smell, the same fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick, the same feeling that everything important was hanging in the balance. I found room 314 and stopped outside the door, suddenly terrified. What if this was a mistake? What if he didn't really want to see me? What if Patricia was in there, ready to have me removed by security for daring to show up where I wasn't wanted? But then I heard his voice through the partially open door, weak and confused, and younger than it had sounded in years. "Mama? Is my mama coming? I need my mama." He was alone. Patricia wasn't there, and neither were any of the friends or colleagues who'd supposedly replaced me in his affections. Just my son, bandaged and frightened and calling for the mother he'd spent 2 years pretending didn't exist. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. He looked so small in that hospital bed, so young despite being 30 years old. His left arm was in a cast, there were stitches across his forehead, and his face was bruised in a way that made my heart clench with protective fury. "Mijo," I whispered, and his eyes opened immediately, focusing on me with an intensity that reminded me of when he was little and had nightmares. "Mama," he breathed, and started crying. Not the controlled, dignified tears of a grown man, but the desperate, relief-filled sobs of a child who'd been lost and was finally found. "Mama, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought I didn't need you anymore, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." I moved to his bedside without thinking, my hand automatically going to his forehead to check for fever the way I'd done when he was young. "Shh, baby. I'm here. I'm here now. I've been so stupid," he continued, the words tumbling out between sobs. "Patricia, everything she said about you was wrong. Everything I believed was wrong. I lost my job, Mama, 3 months ago, and when I told her, she said maybe we should take a break, that she needed to think about whether this was the life she wanted." My heart broke for him, but not in the desperate way it had broken for myself. This was the clean pain of maternal love, uncomplicated by ego or wounded pride. My son was hurting, and nothing else mattered. She took Gabriel to her mother's house. He whispered, said she needed space to figure out if she could handle being married to someone who couldn't provide the lifestyle she expected. She's been gone 2 weeks, and I don't even know if I want her to come back. I just want my son. But she says I can't see him until I get my life together. I listened as the whole story poured out of him. How Patricia's family had pulled back their support the moment his career hit a bump. How the friends they'd cultivated had disappeared when the dinner party stopped and the expensive gifts dried up. How he'd been living in that big house alone, sleeping in the nursery sometimes just to feel close to Gabriel, wondering how his life had become so empty despite having everything he'd thought he wanted. The accident happened because I was distracted, he admitted. I was driving and thinking about you, about how I treated you at the wedding, about how I threw away your gift for Gabriel. I was remembering things you used to tell me when I was young, about how family is the only thing that really matters, about how you can't build happiness on other people's unhappiness. And I realized I'd become someone you wouldn't recognize. Someone I don't recognize. I squeezed his uninjured hand, feeling the calluses that had developed from the physical work he'd been doing since losing his office job. I've always recognized you, mijo, even when you couldn't recognize yourself. I found your letters, he said suddenly. The ones you sent after the wedding. Patricia had been hiding them from me, throwing them away, but I found them in the garbage can outside, and I read them all. Every single one. You never said anything bad about her, even after what she did to you. You just said you loved me and you'd always be my mother no matter what. Those letters. I'd written them in the weeks after the wedding, when the pain was still fresh, and I still believed that words might bridge the gap between us. I'd given up after the first few went unanswered, assuming they'd simply been ignored. I never knew they'd been intercepted, that my son had never even seen my attempts to reach him. I kept the blanket, he said quietly, the one you made for Gabriel. I took it out of the garbage after Patricia went inside. I've been keeping it in my room, and sometimes I hold it and try to remember what it felt like to have a mother who loved me unconditionally. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was my son, broken and alone, finally understanding the value of what he'd thrown away. 2 years ago, this moment would have felt like victory. Now it just felt like sadness. For the time we'd lost, for the pain we'd both endured, for the grandson I still barely knew. Mama, he said, his voice getting stronger. I know I don't deserve it. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But if you'll let me, if you'll give me another chance, I want to try to be your son again. Not Patricia's version of your son, but your actual son. The one you raised to be better than this. I looked at this man I'd loved before he was born. This child who'd been my whole world for 25 years before letting someone else convince him I wasn't worth keeping. He was asking for forgiveness, but not in the desperate way I'd once begged for his attention. He was asking with the humility of someone who'd learned the difference between what he wanted and what he needed. You never stopped being my son, I told him simply. Even when you forgot, even when you tried to erase me, you were still mine. That's what mothers do. We love you through the forgetting until you remember again. Outside the hospital room window, I could see the sun setting over the city where I'd raised him, where I'd lost him, and where, maybe, I was about to find him again. But this time would be different. This time, I wouldn't be accepting whatever scraps of affection he was willing to offer. This time, if we rebuilt our relationship, it would be on the foundation of mutual respect and recognition of what we'd both learned in our time apart. The mother who'd been dismissed from his wedding was gone. The son who'd thrown away her gifts was gone too. What remained were two people who'd survived their worst mistakes and were ready to see if love could be stronger than pride, deeper than disappointment, more lasting than the wounds they'd inflicted on each other. But that conversation would have to wait. For now, it was enough that he was safe, that he was asking for his mother, and that I was here to answer when he called. The confrontation came 3 days later, when Patricia finally decided to grace the hospital with her presence. I was sitting beside Andres' bed, helping him eat lunch because his left arm was still in a cast, when she swept into the room like a storm that had been building for weeks. She looked perfect, as always. Hair styled, makeup flawless, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But there was something different about her now, a hardness around her eyes, a tightness to her smile that betrayed the desperation beneath her polished exterior. "Andres, darling," she said, completely ignoring my presence as if I were a piece of hospital furniture. "I came as soon as I could. Mother insisted on keeping Gabriel for a few more days while we sort out this situation." She moved to kiss him, but Andres turned his head slightly, and her lips landed on his cheek instead of his mouth. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about how much had changed in the 3 days since I'd returned to his life. "Patricia," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Of course, darling. What is it?" She settled into the chair on the opposite side of his bed, finally acknowledging me with a cold nod. "Hello, Maria. I didn't expect to see you here." "My mother had every right to be here," Andres said, his voice stronger than it had been since the accident. "She's my emergency contact. She's been taking care of me." Patricia's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "Well, yes, I suppose someone had to, since you didn't think to call me immediately when the accident happened." "I was unconscious for 6 hours," Andres replied. "And when I woke up, the first person I asked for was my mother. Not you, my mother." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Patricia looked from Andres to me and back again, clearly recalculating her approach. She'd walked in expecting to find a grateful husband, ready to accept whatever terms she offered for her return. Instead, she found a man who was looking at her with new eyes. "Patricia," Andres continued, his voice calm but firm, "did you intercept letters my mother sent me? Did you throw them away without telling me?" She started to deny it, then seemed to realize that the truth was already out. "Andres, you have to understand. She was trying to interfere in our marriage. Those letters were full of guilt trips and manipulation. I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" His voice rose slightly. "From what? From my mother's love? From the woman who raised me? From someone who couldn't accept that you'd moved on to a better life?" Patricia snapped, her composure finally cracking. She represented everything we were trying to leave behind. The small thinking, the limited expectations, the working-class mentality that would have held you back forever. I felt Andres's hand tighten around mine. In that moment, I saw him clearly understand what I'd known for years, that Patricia hadn't fallen in love with him, but with the idea of transforming him into something he wasn't. "And what about Gabriel?" Andres asked quietly. "What about the gifts my mother tried to give our son? The blanket she knitted for him?" Patricia's face flushed red. That was different. We agreed we wanted Gabriel to have the best of everything. We couldn't have him getting attached to cheap handmade things when he deserved so much better. "Cheap?" I spoke for the first time since she'd entered the room, my voice steady despite the anger burning in my chest. "That blanket took me 3 months to make. Every stitch was made with love for a grandson I wasn't allowed to meet. You threw away love, Patricia. You threw away love and called it protecting your child." "Don't lecture me about love," Patricia shot back, her voice turning sharp and ugly. "You had your chance to raise a child, and look how that turned out." Andres needed to learn about the real world, about ambition and success, and making something of himself. Not about settling for mediocrity and calling it love. The words hung in the air like poison. In her fury, Patricia had finally revealed exactly what she thought of the woman who'd shaped the man she'd married. She'd shown her true colors, and they were as ugly as I'd always suspected. "Patricia," Andres said, his voice deadly quiet, "my mother worked 2 jobs to put me through college. She sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities she never had. She taught me about kindness, about loyalty, about what real love looks like. And you convinced me to throw all of that away because you were embarrassed by where I came from." "I wasn't embarrassed," Patricia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I just wanted better for us, for our family." "Better than what?" Andres demanded. "Better than unconditional love? Better than someone who would stand by me when things got difficult? Because where exactly were you when I lost my job, Patricia? Where was your family when I needed support? Patricia's face went pale. That's different. We needed time to think, to plan. You needed time to decide if I was still worth your investment. Andres interrupted. And the answer was no, wasn't it? The moment I couldn't provide the lifestyle you expected, you packed up our son and left. But my mother? My mother has been here every day since my accident. She's been feeding me, reading to me, holding my hand when the pain gets bad. Not because I can give her anything, but because she loves me. That's the difference between your kind of love and hers. I watched Patricia's expression change as she realized she was losing this battle. The manipulation that had worked so well when Andres was desperate for acceptance in her world had no power over a man who'd remembered his own worth. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. You're choosing the past over the future. You're choosing limitation over possibility. No, Andres said firmly. I'm choosing real love over conditional acceptance. I'm choosing family over status. I'm choosing the woman who taught me how to be a good man over the woman who tried to make me ashamed of where I came from. Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hospital floor. Fine, but don't come crawling back when you realize what you're giving up. Don't expect me to wait while you play house with your mother and pretend this fantasy is going to last. I'm not giving up anything important, Andres replied. But I am done giving up things that matter. I want to see my son, Patricia. I want Gabriel to know his grandmother. I want him to understand that love isn't about having the most expensive things. It's about having people who will love you even when you have nothing. Gabriel is my son too, Patricia said coldly, and I will not have him influenced by people who can't provide the life he deserves. Gabriel is our son, Andres corrected, and he deserves to know all of his family, not just the parts you approve of. Patricia looked at both of us, her face a mask of fury and calculation. We'll see about that, she said finally. We'll just see. She swept out of the room as dramatically as she'd entered, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the echo of threats that would come to nothing. Andres squeezed my hand and looked at me with eyes that held both regret and relief. I'm sorry you had to hear that, Mama. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what she really thought of you, of us. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way, mijo, I said gently. What matters is that you learned them. Outside the hospital window, storm clouds were gathering, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The truth had finally been spoken. The masks had finally come off, and my son, my real son, not the person Patricia had tried to mold him into, was finally coming home. The battle wasn't over. Patricia would fight for Gabriel, would try to use our grandson as a weapon in whatever custody arrangement followed. But for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't facing that fight alone. I had my son back, and together, we would find a way to bring Gabriel home too. The custody hearing was scheduled for a gray Tuesday in November, almost 8 months after the hospital confrontation that had changed everything. I sat in the courthouse hallway beside Andres, watching him review his notes one more time, his hands steadier than they'd been in months. He'd gotten a new job, not as prestigious as his old one, but honest work that paid enough to support his son and rebuild his life on solid ground. Gabriel was 2 years old now, a beautiful little boy with Andres's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. I'd been allowed supervised visits for 6 months, 2 hours every other Saturday in a sterile family services office while a social worker took notes. But even in that cold, institutional setting, my grandson had warmed to me quickly, reaching for me with small hands and babbling in the musical way toddlers do when they feel safe. Patricia had fought hard, hiring expensive lawyers and presenting character witnesses who testified about Andres's instability and my negative influence. But the truth has a way of speaking louder than money. And the truth was that Gabriel thrived during our visits, that Andres had transformed himself into a responsible father, and that I represented the kind of stable, unconditional love that children need to grow into secure adults. The judge was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She reminded me of my own mother, and I took that as a good sign. She'd reviewed all the evidence, interviewed all the parties, and spent considerable time observing Gabriel interact with both sides of his family. This court's primary concern, she said, looking over her reading glasses at all of us, is the best interest of the child. Gabriel needs stability, love, and access to family members who will contribute positively to his development. Patricia sat across the courtroom with her lawyer, dressed in a conservative suit that was probably chosen to make her look like the responsible parent. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped her purse like a lifeline. She'd already lost the war for Andres' affections. Now she was fighting to keep the last weapon she had against us. Based on my review of the evidence and my observations of the family dynamics, the judge continued, I'm awarding primary custody to Mr. Andres Torres, with visitation rights for Mrs. Patricia Torres Morrison every other weekend and alternate holidays. Andres' hand found mine, squeezing gently as relief flooded through both of us. Gabriel would come home. Gabriel would grow up knowing his father, knowing his grandmother, understanding that love doesn't require perfection, but it does require presence. Furthermore, the judge added, I see no reason why the paternal grandmother, Mrs. Maria Torres, should not have regular, unsupervised access to her grandson. The evidence shows that she provides a stable, loving environment that contributes to the child's emotional well-being. Patricia's face went white. She'd spent 2 years trying to erase me from Gabriel's life, and now the law itself was affirming my place in his world. Justice, it seemed, had its own timeline. The first night Gabriel stayed in our house, I'd moved in with Andres to help with childcare while he worked. He slept in the crib Andres had set up in what used to be his childhood bedroom. I stood in the doorway watching my grandson sleep, this little miracle who'd been kept from me for so long, and I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Complete peace. Andres found me there, standing guard over Gabriel like the grandmother I'd always been meant to be. Thank you, Mama, he whispered, for waiting, for forgiving me, for still being here when I finally came to my senses. That's what mothers do, I said simply. We wait. We forgive. We're here. Over the following months, we built a new kind of family. Not the traditional nuclear unit Patricia had envisioned, but something more honest and resilient. Andres and I worked together to raise Gabriel, sharing cooking duties and bedtime stories and the 1,000 small tasks that make up daily life with a toddler. Gabriel learned to say abuela before he could properly pronounce most other words. He'd run to me when he skinned his knees, curl up in my lap when he was tired, and insist that I read him the same bedtime story every night. A tale about a little boy who lived with his father and grandmother and was loved so much that even the moon smiled down on their house. Patricia exercised her visitation rights sporadically at first, then less and less frequently as her new life took precedence over motherhood. She'd remarried within a year, choosing a wealthy businessman who treated Gabriel like an inconvenience rather than a stepson. Her visits became perfunctory, obligation rather than joy, and Gabriel began to prefer staying home with us to spending weekends in a house where he was expected to be seen but not heard. I didn't feel triumph in her gradual withdrawal from Gabriel's life. I felt sadness for what she was missing, for the love she was choosing not to accept. But I also felt protective satisfaction that my grandson would grow up knowing the difference between conditional and unconditional love, between being wanted and being treasured. The neighbors who'd once whispered about my disgrace now stopped by regularly to check on Gabriel and bring small gifts. Mrs. Hernandez taught him to plant vegetables in our garden. The mailman saved interesting stamps for his collection. The whole community that had watched my exile now celebrated my restoration, understanding that sometimes the strongest families are the ones that survive being broken and choose to rebuild themselves with more wisdom than they had before. On Gabriel's 3rd birthday, we threw a party in our backyard. Nothing fancy, just cake and balloons, and the kind of simple joy that children understand better than adults. Gabriel sat in my lap to blow out his candles, his small hands over mine as we made a wish together. I wished for his happiness, for his health, for a future filled with people who would love him the way he deserved to be loved. After the guests left and Gabriel was asleep, Andres and I sat on the back porch drinking coffee and watching fireflies dance around the garden we'd planted together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Patricia had accepted you from the beginning? He asked. I considered the question carefully. I think about it sometimes, I said, but I've learned that some gifts come disguised as losses. If she'd accepted me, You might never have learned to value what real love looks like. Gabriel might never have understood that the most precious things in life can't be bought or sold. And you might never have discovered how strong you really are, Andreas added. He was right. The woman who'd been dismissed from his wedding was someone who'd derived her worth from other people's approval. The woman sitting on this porch was someone who'd learned to find value in her own character, her own choices, her own capacity for love. I'd been broken down to my foundation and rebuilt myself stronger. Besides, I said, smiling at the sound of Gabriel's gentle snoring drifting through his bedroom window, this is exactly where we're supposed to be. All three of us, together, in a house full of love that doesn't depend on anyone's permission to exist. The fireflies continued their ancient dance, blinking in and out of the darkness like tiny stars, like promises, like hope made visible. And I realized that this quiet evening with my son and grandson sleeping safely under the same roof, this garden we'd planted with our own hands, this love we'd fought to preserve and rebuild, this was what victory looked like. Not revenge, not vindication, but something simpler and more profound. The knowledge that I'd survived my worst nightmare and emerged with my capacity for love, not just intact, but expanded. I'd learned that sometimes the people who try to erase you end up teaching you how indelible you really are. Gabriel would grow up knowing his abuela's story, understanding that love is not always easy, but it's always worth fighting for. He'd learn that families can be broken and mended, that hearts can be wounded and healed, that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in never falling down, but in getting back up with more wisdom than you had before. And I would spend the rest of my days making sure he never doubted, not for a single moment, that he was precious beyond measure, loved beyond condition, and worthy of a place at any table where real family gathered to celebrate the beautiful, imperfect, irreplaceable bonds that make us human.